So in the past week, the PM finally announced this.
Today we have an announcement of the COVID inquiry. That is important that it take place.
It's been a long time coming. In case there are any doubts, before I get into this, let me say that, in my opinion, this was a fairly disappointing announcement. It's the kind of inquiry you announce when you really don't want to find out too much. The kind of inquiry that makes me sit back and ask, what's the point? There's been a little bit of noise around the fact that this won't be a royal commission, and deservedly so. I mean, how can you justify a watered down inquiry with limited scope when we're talking about the biggest public health crisis we've seen in living memory? Here are some raw numbers for context. Since the start of the pandemic, there have been almost 23,000 COVID-19 deaths in Australia. We've also seen a reduction in life expectancy, along with excess death rates that continue to run into double figures percentage-wise. That's before we talk about the debilitating impacts of long COVID, which has had an inquiry all of its own. If the government don't view the response to all of this as worthy of a full royal commission, then what will meet their criteria? Given that the obvious questions at this presser were always going to be around why the government had chosen to go down the path of a limited inquiry instead of a royal commission, the PM's responses were not entirely convincing. Let's take a look.
The moment it's not a royal commission, can state leaders be compelled to give evidence, or would they say no?
Well, the idea that this at starting point is how can we force someone to do something? How can we get conflict? Is completely contrary. It's completely contrary to the spirit. Well, which state leaders? Premier Marshall was the leader here in South Australia. There's been a change of government. Well, there's been a change of government in two of the states. And at the time of the pandemic, there were 3 Liberal premiers in states and 3 Labor premiers. This should not be a source of conflict. And the idea that this should be subject to political bickering is not what the objective is here. That's old. That's old politics. Well, which state leaders? Which state? Well, the others. Marshall. Look, this is not a.
Andrews is still in the job. Can he say no if he is asked to give evidence?
Well, why do you say Dan Andrews? There are 6.
Because you pointed out that there's been a change.
There are 6. Well, there's been a change of premier in WA. There's been the change of premier in Tasmania as well. There's been a range of changes being made. This isn't aimed at conflict. This is aimed at people being able to participate. And I raised this at the National Cabinet, and all of the premiers and chief ministers welcomed this approach.
We probably shouldn't be surprised that they welcomed this approach in place of a royal commission, given that this approach will mean that the majority of their decisions are not scrutinised.
Prime Minister, royal commission?
Because I promised one royal commission as leader of the Labor Party. That was into robo-debt. And that has reported and has been effective. One of the things we've learned about royal commissions is that they can roll on and on and on for year after year after year. We've learnt that with the Royal Commission into veterans issues has been extended. We are still having a Royal Commission into the treatment and disabilities issues that has been going for some period of time.
Sure, that may be true, but it's also true that the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, arguably one of the highest profile royal commissions in recent times, took less than a year to complete, starting in August 2022 and delivering its final report in July 2023, proving that if there's a will, there's a way.
Why the rush to get it done within a year then, especially if there has already been 20 inquiries? Wouldn't a Royal Commission get down to the bottom of it once and for all?
No one promised a Royal Commission. I see the attempt by the coalition to somehow say that that's the case. And I find it extraordinary
Technically he's right, or at least from what I've been able to find. He's not specifically promised a Royal Commission. He's left the option of a Royal Commission on the table for 18 months and not specifically ruled it out, but he has never explicitly promised a Royal Commission. Albo has been very careful in choosing his words on this issue when asked about a potential Royal Commission in the past, making sure he gives himself enough wriggle room so as not to be pinned.
It is beyond doubt that you will need an assessment. Whether that be a Royal Commission or some form of inquiry, that will need to happen.
That is consistent with his messaging on this. The closest he got to suggesting that there'd be an actual Royal Commission was this.
Are you going to call a Royal Commission into this so Australians know exactly what was going on?
I've said consistently that once we were through the pandemic, it would be inconceivable, regardless of who won the election in May, that you would not have a proper examination of the circumstances around the handling of the pandemic.
Still vague enough to wriggle out of. With all that said, I'd argue that the assumption that there would be a push for a Royal Commission is understandable, given the simple fact that the Senate Select Committee, chaired by Labor, and Katie Gallagher, outlined in its final report, delivered in April 2022, that it recommended a Royal Commission be established to examine Australia's pandemic response. The cynic in me suggests that had Labor found themselves in opposition and not in government, they'd be pushing for a Royal Commission right now too.
Wouldn't the concern be that if an inquiry only gives us select information, whereas a Royal Commission would allow us to compel past leaders and current leaders to give us all the information that we need?
Well, a Royal Commission is usually presided over by a judge or someone with a legal background. What we have here is an inquiry that is led by a leading public servant who understands the way that the public sector works at Commonwealth and state level, a leading health expert, Professor Bennett, and a leading health economist in Dr. Jackson. That's the information that we need going forward. And Australians need to look forward on this. There are a range of opinions, and certainly I find the Coalition's argument that we don't want to concentrate on the issues of the former government. I'm not quite sure what people think the incentive is for a new government, like the one I lead, to not go back. But we're determined to actually make sure, and that's why we have an inquiry led by 3 appropriate people, and that is the form that we've established. Sure.
You said that Royal Commissions can go on for years, but the Robo-Debt Commission that you pointed out was sort of one. Is there a reason why that process could have been applied here?
Well, I'm not quite sure why we are doing exactly what the inquiry. I just pointed out that Royal Commissions are usually led by judges or former judges. They look at things in a particular way. What we want to look at is what are the economic impacts. That's why we have an economic impact expert. What are the health impacts? So we have a health expert. And what are the governance issues and the issues both Commonwealth and state. And this is a positive move going forward. This is perfectly consistent with what governments like Singapore have done to look forward.
So will border closures and the length of lockdowns be looked at?
Well, they can look at whatever they like. That's the point of an independent inquiry.
Now that would be nice if it were true. Unfortunately, however, it's not. The inquiry's terms of reference clearly spell out what areas are not in scope for the inquiry. And the first dot point here is the big one. Actions taken unilaterally by state and territory governments. It took a pandemic for most of the population to realise just how much power the states and territories held when it came to making decisions that would directly and significantly impact their lives. When you look back on the first 2 years of the pandemic, many of the decisions that had the biggest impact on you were likely unilateral actions taken by your state government. State border closures, managing hospitals, shutting non-essential businesses and defining what essential meant, school closures, contact tracing, mask and vaccine mandates. These are all things decided on by state governments and therefore likely to fall outside the scope of this inquiry. You can probably now see why state leaders are quite happy with Albo's call to go down the limited inquiry path rather than full-blown Royal Commission. So yeah, this will be an independent inquiry in that the government have selected 3 people to run it and limited the scope of what they can look at. Does that meet your definition of independent?
Of course, Australians will recall, will never forget what the country went through in 2020 and 2021 in particular.
It's a sad truth that the majority of COVID deaths in Australia have occurred since Labor came to power. Hopefully the inquiry is empowered to look just as hard at the last 18 months as they do the first 2 years of the pandemic.
It is appropriate that when we reached a certain period that we would have an inquiry. It's a commitment I made before the election, and one of the things that we've been doing is ticking off all those commitments that we have made.
Albo kinda says the quiet bit out loud here. For me, it really summarises most of his government's terms so far. Housing, environment, transparency. A lot of box ticking without taking any great strides in any particular area. A box ticking inquiry is not what we need. If that's all the government want, they may as well just hand the whole thing over to Dr. Nick, have him whip up a PowerPoint presentation and be done with it. At the end of the day, if you're unwilling to look at everything, how can you expect to learn anything?